Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into some really fascinating material that you've brought.
Yeah, this is really a rich text and a lot to unpack here.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. And what we're going to try to do is explore not just the stories themselves, but the stories within the characters,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like, we want to understand their motivations. We want to understand those inner lives, those narratives that are maybe hidden beneath the surface. And we'll do that by, kind of sharing our initial reactions and interpretations as we go through this material.
Right.
But then, in a sense, we're going to kind of rewind and look at everything again with fresh eyes and see, like, what new layers emerge.
Exactly. And I think what's so compelling about this particular source material is just how much it is sort of, about human psychology. It's not just a sequence of events. It's a tapestry that's woven with these like really complex inner lives,
Yeah.
individuals grappling with like fundamental questions. So, even as we explore Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, like we're not just looking at his actions, we're trying to understand the motivations.
Maybe the hidden narratives that are driving them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so like let's unpack this a little bit. I think the natural starting point here is Fyodor, right?
Right.
Like the patriarch of this family. And when we first encounter him, it's after his wife's death. And the details are immediately striking,
Yeah.
right? So there are these like conflicting accounts of how she died.
Right.
Some say typhus, others say starvation.
Hmm.
And Fyodor's response is, well, excessive drinking is involved, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Right? And then we see these kind of opaque financial dealings
Right.
with his son Mitya,
Yeah.
which, years later leave Mitya in a precarious position.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me how these initial details really set up Fyodor Pavlovich as such a morally ambiguous figure. And that's, it really sort of sets the stage for a lot of the major themes
Yeah.
that we're going to explore in this text. And I think, one of the most crucial insights that we get from this opening is just the whole idea of the unreliable narrator.
Yeah. Right. And how bias shapes perception.
Right.
And this is going to be so crucial as we sort of navigate these complex human relationships that are, going to like dominate this story. So we're immediately prompted to ask, like, can we trust this portrayal of events?
Right.
Right. How has his particular lens influenced the stories of his sons?
Yeah. And I mean, that pattern of, questionable behavior continues.
Right.
I mean, with his second marriage, it's heavily implied that, his young orphan bride wouldn't have agreed to the marriage had she really known what Fyodor was about. Right. Then you have Grigory, this servant,
Right.
who, loathed Fyodor's first wife,
Yeah.
but then surprisingly becomes this staunch supporter of the second wife,
Uh,
even intervening physically to protect her during, some of Fyodor's more unruly moments,
right.
which speaks volumes.
It does. I mean, Grigory's loyalty, it's almost like, it really throws a spotlight on just how deeply unpleasant Fyodor must have been.
Yeah.
Right. For someone who had such strong negative feelings towards his first wife, to then sort of step in and become so protective of the second, that suggests there must have been some significant mistreatment happening there.
Right.
It also introduces this like fascinating dynamic within the household, where it's almost like we're getting this like silent commentary
Right.
on Fyodor's character
Yeah.
through like the reactions of those around him.
Yeah. Now, we do get like this brief window into Fyodor's time in Odessa.
Yeah.
He apparently moved through like a lot of different social circles and seemed to like develop a real knack for like making and hoarding money.
Right.
And when he returns to town, some years later, he's described as looking terribly aged, which suggests, a life that might have taken a toll on him despite his financial success.
Right. And this Odessa period, I think it's really kind of a pivotal point. It's sort of adding a layer to Fyodor's like, core story, which is this pursuit of material wealth. And so, this success that he has financially, but then this contrast with his physical decline, I think, it could suggest that he led a life that was devoid of like deeper fulfillment.
Yeah.
It almost highlights a narrative of like, misplaced priorities.
Yeah.
And I think it sets the stage, too, for these later conflicts that he has with his sons.
Right.
Where money becomes a significant point of contention.
Right. Okay, so let's bring Alyosha into the picture here.
Okay.
Right. We see this like stark contrast,
Right.
with his choice of the monastic life,
Right.
compared to Fyodor's, existence, which is much more worldly.
Yeah.
And, even though Fyodor seems to have like an initial affection for Alyosha,
Yeah.
it's always tinged with this cynicism,
Yes.
right? Not just about monks, but about women too.
Exactly. And I think that this contrast, between these two characters really sort of highlights one of the central thematic tensions that runs through the entire text,
Hmm.
which is this conflict between the spiritual and the material.
Mhm.
Right? We see Alyosha embracing this pursuit of faith and sort of offering one path, while Fyodor, remains very much rooted in these earthly desires. And his cynical remarks, I think, about both monks and women kind of reveal a consistent underlying skepticism about ideals. And
Wow.
perhaps, maybe even a fear of genuine connection,
Hmm.
right? A fear of vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have the figure of the elder,
Right.
who's surrounded by this really intense faith.
Mm.
Alyosha's belief in the elder's miracles it's absolute, almost unwavering.
Right.
We hear these stories of people claiming to be healed through the elder's prayers,
Right.
which only reinforces that kind of, fervent belief.
Yeah. And the elder becomes this, really crucial point, I think, for exploring the theme of faith.
Yeah.
And Alyosha's, unquestioning belief in these miracles that are tied to the elder really kind of speaks to his own inner narrative of devotion.
Right.
Right. And the power of the spiritual. But, I think that the presence of these claims also sort of invites us to consider, the nature of belief itself, right? Is it about tangible proof?
Yeah.
Or is it about a deeper, more personal conviction?
Yeah. Okay, so this sets the stage for this initial encounter at the Hermitage.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of a clash of personalities. You have Fyodor and Musov, who have completely opposing views on the monks. Right? And then Fyodor's behavior is, it's farcical, right?
Right, right.
He tells this completely made-up story about Diderot being christened,
Yeah.
which on the spot he admits to having fabricated.
Yeah.
Right.
It's fantastic.
It is, and this scene I think is really crucial for understanding Fyodor's own internal story. Right? There's this need for attention,
Yes.
right? Like a desire to shock, and just this a fundamental disrespect for genuine belief. Right. And his admission, that he invents the Diderot story to add piquancy.
Yeah.
It just reveals this performative aspect to his cynicism.
Right, right. He's crafting a narrative of himself
Yeah.
as this witty, iconoclast,
Right.
even if it's based on falsehoods.
Right. Right. But, amidst all of this chaos, you see that the elder is actually remarkably perceptive.
Right. Yeah.
And we see that in his interaction with this distressed woman
Right.
who's doubting her faith. And, despite Fyodor's, absurdity, the elder kind of recognizes and validates the sincerity of her suffering.
Exactly. And I think the elder's kind of quiet empathy, it really sort of cuts through Fyodor's constructed persona.
Right.
It reveals a deeper narrative of, human compassion
Yeah.
and his ability to connect with genuine pain amidst all of this superficiality, I think really underscores the power of authentic experience
Right.
versus performative cynicism.
Right. Right. We also get a glimpse of Lise during this visit.
Yeah.
And she kind of has this playful, almost attention-seeking behavior toward Alyosha.
Right.
It's a small moment, but I
Yeah.
think it hints at a story that's, brewing there.
Yeah. And I think even in these small interactions, we start to see the beginnings of Lisa's own narrative.
Yeah.
This desire for connection, maybe a little bit of, youthful flirtation. And I think it suggests to us that every character, no matter how briefly they're introduced, really carries their own potential story within this larger narrative.
Yeah. Now, the discussion at the Hermitage also touches on this, I think, really significant ideological clash. Right, which is about the church's role in the state. And one of the characters argues that the church should encompass the whole state, a view that's very strongly supported by Father Paisy.
Right. And I think, this debate is really kind of revealing a core tension in the societal stories that are being told here, which is this relationship between spiritual authority and secular power. Right.
Right. So the argument that the church should encompass the whole state really kind of reflects a very specific vision.
Yeah.
Of how these narratives should intersect.
Yeah.
And it's a vision, obviously, that has a lot of, historical and philosophical weight behind it.
Right, right. Building on that, the elder talks about the church's role in restraining criminals. And he argues for inner conscience as the true chastisement, not just mechanical punishment.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And here we're sort of delving into the story of justice and redemption within this text,
Yeah.
right? And this emphasis on inner conscience, really suggests a narrative of moral transformation that's driven by, like, faith and love,
Right.
rather than simply by external force. And it's a pretty powerful, I think, commentary on the nature of true accountability.
Right. Right. Okay, so now let's turn to Dmitri, or Mitya.
Okay.
He's described as, like, physically striking, but with an unhealthy look, right? And his reaction at the Hermitage is indignant. He directly accuses his father of seeking scandal.
Right. And I think Mitya's, like, physical description here is giving us a hint that there's, like, this inner conflict happening. He's got this outward strength, but there's also this, like, inner turmoil.
Yeah.
And his outburst really reveals his own narrative of frustration and even resentment that he has towards his father. He sees right through Fyodor's performance and recognizes, this pattern of just disruptive behavior.
Yeah. And then comes this, like, very significant moment, right, where the elder speaks to Alyosha and he says, "I shall soon die." Right. So he's foretelling his own death.
Wow.
But he also tells Alyosha, be near your brothers. Right. So it's
Yeah.
almost like he's instructing Alyosha to play a specific role.
Right.
Right. In these unfolding stories.
Yeah, this is a huge shift for Alyosha's narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, he's no longer just a novice, right? He's given a specific role to play
Right.
in the unfolding stories of his brothers. And this elder's premonition, I think it adds this, like, really, like, potent layer of destiny
Yeah.
and interconnectedness
Yeah.
to their individual paths.
Yeah. And Alyosha, his reaction to the premonition it's intense, right? Like he believes the elder completely, but he's also deeply reluctant to leave him. Right. Like this is his, spiritual guide.
Right.
And this is a huge loss for him.
Yeah. And it really kind of underscores just how significant the elder is in Alyosha's life narrative.
Right.
He's facing this, like, major transition, this potential loss of this, like, guiding figure. And he's also being burdened with this enormous responsibility that's placed upon him.
Right. Right. And of course, Fyodor, with his, usual tact, makes this sarcastic remark about taking Alyosha from the monastery, aiming the comment at Ivan, further illustrating the brokenness, of their family.
Right. And it just shows how persistent he is in his need to undermine any sense of, like, unity or spiritual purpose within his family. It's like this tiny but really telling moment in this ongoing narrative of antagonism that he's kind of weaving.
Right. Right. Okay, so then we get a description of the Karamazov's house. And, it's this big house, but it's sparsely populated. Right. So besides Fyodor and Ivan, there are only 3 servants in the lodge.
Okay.
Grigory, Marfa, and Smerdyakov.
Right. And I think the emptiness of the house really kind of mirrors the emotional distance between the family members.
Yeah.
Right? And the sort of isolated presence of those 3 servants, particularly Smerdyakov, I think suggests that they too have their own, really kind of significant, perhaps hidden stories that are playing out within this confined world.
Yeah. We're then introduced to this very tragic story of Lizaveta Smertyachaya, or Stinking Lizaveta, who gives birth in the bathhouse, but she dies, and she's unable to speak.
Right.
And the narrator actually says that her story deserves its own chapter. Right. So it's hinting at the fact that she is important.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm curious, do you think that her muteness, her voicelessness, is that like a deliberate symbol within this narrative?
That's a really interesting question. Lizaveta's silence and her kind of, marginalized position certainly suggests that there's a symbolic role for her here. I mean, even though her story is brief, it really does hint at those themes of vulnerability and the consequences of, like, societal neglect.
Right.
And, her connection to Smerdyakov further deepens the mystery surrounding her and her potential impact on the main narrative.
Yeah. Now, going back to Fyodor, we're reminded of, his shocking behavior at his first wife's death. His, buffoonery actually scandalized those around him.
Right. And I think this really reinforces that consistent character narrative that we're seeing with Fyodor, which is this lack of empathy, this, like, inherent self-centeredness. Right. That just seems to, like, override any social norms or expectations. And I think it really, like, further kind of cements his role as this morally questionable figure whose actions, like, really have these far-reaching consequences.
Right. Okay, so as Alyosha is preparing to visit Katerina Ivanovna, he feels apprehensive, and he wants to see Dmitri first.
Mm.
Right. So it's interesting, like you're seeing his concern
Yeah.
for his brothers, right?
Yeah.
And this uncertainty about, like, what is this conversation going to be like?
Right. And I think Alyosha's role as this, like, kind of reluctant intermediary really sort of highlights his own internal story, which is just him trying to maintain connection
Yeah.
and mediate these conflicts within this incredibly, like, fractured family.
Right.
So, he's caught between the narratives of his two very different brothers.
Yeah.
And then you have Katerina Ivanovna.
Right. So Katerina Ivanovna is introduced as this woman of, distinguished background and social standing who's, made a significant impact on the town.
Yeah.
So you get the sense that this is a woman of power and influence.
Right. And her initial portrayal really kind of establishes her as this figure of, like, strength and respectability.
Yeah.
But then it becomes this really fascinating contrast to the emotional turmoil.
Yeah.
And these really, like, complex relationships that she's going to become entangled in with the Karamazovs.
Right. Right. And we learn that Dmitri has these very passionate but contradictory feelings towards her.
Yes.
He admits to low passions, but insists that he's not a thief. And we also hear about these 3,000 rubles that she asked him to post.
Yeah. So for those listening who might not be familiar with the units of currency in this world, 3,000 rubles seems to be a significant sum, just given the context that we have so far.
Right, right. So,
and I think, Dimitri's this internal conflict, like, between his desires and his sense of honor, this is really going to be central to his story. And this whole incident with the 3,000 rubles, it really feels like a pivotal point in their relationship. It's something that's going to shape their narratives and create a huge amount of tension.
Right. And then the tension just kind of explodes between Fyodor and his sons during this, brandy-fueled exchange. Right?
Yeah.
Fyodor is making these really provocative remarks about God and seems to relish causing offense.
Yeah. Yeah. And this really just underscores that toxic family dynamic that's at play.
Right.
And I think it kind of solidifies Fyodor's role as the primary instigator of this conflict.
Yeah.
These, like, deliberate attempts to provoke his sons. It suggests there's this deep-seated need for control.
Right.
And perhaps this, like, very twisted form of, like, connection through conflict.
Yeah. And the manipulation doesn't stop there, right? He tries to tempt Ivan and then feigns concern for Ivan's lack of love for him.
Right. Yeah, and I think it really reveals this pattern of, like, emotional manipulation that he employs. Right, where he kind of preys on his son's vulnerabilities and attempts to control their emotions, like, to really serve his own needs.
Right. Right. And then suddenly Dmitri bursts in, demanding to know where Grushenka is. Right. And directly accusing his father.
Wow.
So you have this, like, very dramatic entrance, and it just injects this moment of, like, raw conflict into the scene. It's fueled by Dmitri's passionate pursuit of Grushenka and just his very open hostility towards his father.
Right. And I think it's almost like we're witnessing this collision of their individual narratives.
Yeah.
Right, at this point.
Right. And Fyodor's immediate reaction is terror. Right. He clings to Ivan, desperately asks Alyosha about Grushenka.
Wow.
Right. It's like he's afraid of Dmitri.
Right. And I think this fear really underscores, like, the power dynamic between them.
Yeah.
Right. And it highlights the potential for violence within this relationship.
Yeah.
And it's this really stark contrast to his, like, earlier manipulative behavior.
Right. And then kind of shockingly, Fyodor is overjoyed to hear that Grushenka actually won't marry Dmitri.
Oh.
Right. And he warmly shakes Alyosha's hand. Right.
Interesting. And I think this kind of intense reaction really reveals just, like the depth of his desire for Grushenka.
Yeah.
Right? It's like there's this hidden narrative of infatuation that's driving his behavior and obviously creating this further conflict with his son.
Right, right. Now, Alyosha's plan to deliver Dmitri's message takes an unexpected turn.
Okay.
Due to Ivan's, knowing remarks. So
I think Ivan's intervention here suggests that he has his own, like, agenda.
Right.
Right. He's subtly sort of shaping the narratives of those around him.
Yeah.
But his motives are unclear, and that adds a whole other layer of, like, intrigue to the story.
Well, yeah.
And Alyosha feels conflicted, right? He's worried about Dmitri, but there's also this sense of mystery. And he's a little unnerved by Ivan's sudden interest in him.
Right.
Like, it's this connection that he once really longed for, but now he's kind of apprehensive.
Right, and I think Alyosha's internal struggle here reflects his growing awareness of just how, like, complex
Yeah.
and potentially dangerous this web of relationships
Right.
within his family really is. You know,
Yeah.
he's starting to realize that connection
Yeah.
doesn't always equate to safety
Right.
or understanding.
Right. Right. So observing Katerina Ivanovna, Alyosha sees her beauty, but also notes that there's this like fleeting passion rather than lasting love in her eyes and her lips. It's
Hmm.
a thought he almost shares with Dmitri, showing his insightful nature.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, Alyosha's keen observation here reveals his developing understanding
Hmm.
of human emotions, right? And these often like very hidden narratives of desire and longing that are driving people's actions.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. And Katerina Ivanovna intensely analyzes Dmitri's farewell message,
Right.
right? And she questions Alyosha, is he afraid for her or for himself?
Mm.
Right. And it shows kind of her pride and insecurity.
Yeah, and I think this like really detailed analysis that she's doing highlights her own internal story.
Hmm.
Right? This interplay of pride and vulnerability.
Yeah.
She's desperately trying to decipher like Dimitri's true feelings
Yeah.
and her own position in this like incredibly complex relationship.
Yeah. She's also, you know, outwardly very defiant about Grushenka,
Mm-hmm.
but she's nervously laughing at the same time.
Right.
Right. So like there's that underlying anxiety.
Yeah, it's like her outward confidence is masking this like inner turmoil, this
Yeah.
recognition that Grushenka is like a real threat
Right.
to her relationship.
Right. And then suddenly Grushenka makes a really striking appearance.
Okay.
Right. And there's this very pointed interaction between her and Katerina Ivanovna.
Right.
It really reveals this like sharp antagonism.
Right. And this like direct confrontation is really bringing like this underlying rivalry, to the surface,
Right.
right? It's this like clash of two really powerful female narratives
Yeah.
who are vying for the attention of the same man.
Right. Right. So Alyosha's hurrying back right,
Yeah.
to the monastery. And at the crossroads, he runs into Dmitri, who urgently needs money.
Mm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it just underscores like Dmitri's ongoing financial desperation.
Yeah. And I think it kind of reinforces, too, how Dimitri's financial situation is just going to become this like huge driving force
Yeah.
behind his action.
Right. Right. So we learned that, the monks have gathered after the elder's death.
Mm.
Right. But their motives are mixed.
Yeah.
Right. Some are insincere,
Right.
which Alyosha is starting to recognize.
Yeah. And this kind of reveals that even within the seemingly pure context of monastic life,
Yeah.
individual narratives and motivations can be really complex
Right.
and even self-serving.
Right. Right. And Father Farapont kind of emerges as this like dissenting voice.
Right.
Right. He really disagrees with the elders.
Right.
And, there are a growing number of monks and visitors who admire his asceticism.
Hmm.
Right.
Right.
Despite considering him somewhat mad.
Yeah.
So asceticism, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, refers to this practice of severe self-discipline and abstention from indulgence.
Right.
Right. So it's like this very, very austere approach.
Yeah. And so Father Farapont's like dissenting voice is really interesting because it's introducing this like kind of counter narrative, right, within this like monastic community.
Yeah.
And it emphasizes this more rigorous
Yeah.
and perhaps, less accommodating form of faith.
Right. Right. And Fyodor continues his, pattern of cynical remarks about sin, rejects Alyosha's paradise. Right. So he remains pretty skeptical.
Right. And Fyodor really remains consistent in his rejection of like any spiritual ideals.
Yeah.
His narrative, I think, is just firmly grounded in this earthly cynicism.
Right. He starts revealing this like paranoia about Ivan and schemes involving Grushenka and Katerina Ivanovna. So you're also seeing like this deep mistrust.
Right. And his paranoia really highlights those like, deep-seated insecurities that he has.
Yeah.
And his inability to trust those around him. He
Yeah.
always seems to suspect that there's these hidden agendas.
Yeah. Now his mood suddenly shifts.
Okay.
Right.
Mhm.
And he very abruptly dismisses Alyosha.
Wow.
So you're seeing like this unpredictability.
Right. And it just underscores, I think, the instability of Fyodor's character.
Yeah.
And the difficulty that we have as readers and even as like, participants in this conversation of really understanding like what his true motivations are.
Right, right. Now, as Alyosha's leaving, he kisses Fyodor on the shoulder.
Oh.
Right. And it gets this, like, surprised reaction
Yeah.
and some rather ambiguous words.
Yeah, it's this unexpected gesture, like, almost of affection, I think, that creates this, like, very fleeting moment of
Mm-hmm.
potential connection. And I think it really speaks to, like, the complexity of their relationship.
Yeah, yeah. So then we have Madame Holikov, who is, very dramatically instructing Alyosha about Dmitri's message.
Right.
Her concern seems very exaggerated.
Right. And, Madame Holokov's, like, theatrical nature.
Yeah.